Welcome to What's at Stake, a Penta podcast. I'm Bryan DeAngelis, a partner here at Penta, and today I'm joined by a couple of my Penta colleagues. Michael Griffin is our Chief Research Officer over on the intelligence side of the business, and Meghan Pennington is a partner for Penta Intelligence. They're here today to talk about the Washington Insights Review. Meghan, Michael, thanks for joining us.
Hey, Ryan.
So this report, it's based on the hundreds of conversations that you all conduct with DC policymakers and highlights their perspectives, not only on policy issues, but also advocacy best practices. We're excited to hear more about it and get into the report, and maybe more importantly for our audience, really discuss the importance of engaging with DC and policymakers as a key kind of stakeholder group for all sorts of organizations, companies, nonprofits, et cetera. So let's jump into it. Meghan, I'll ask you maybe to kick it off. We talk a lot on this podcast about this new Congress and the political dynamics, I would say, especially in the House, but leading up to 2024, we're going to have a lot of conversations here about all of that. Thinking about this research and the conversations you all are having, how do you kind of take a look at the political environment on behalf of your clients engaging in DC?
So, Brian, I think it comes as no surprise for me to say that Washington is incredibly polarized right now. We see it in the media. We see it in the fact that it's very difficult to get any kind of big legislation to move. It seems like it's difficult even to find an issue where Republicans and Democrats can even have a conversation and agree on the facts or the theory of the case, right? So what does that mean? I think it can actually get a bit frustrating for, I would have to imagine, people that work in government relations when they just hear all the time, partisanship. Okay, so what does it mean? Actually, I think it, that indicates there's a way to deal with partisanship. It means that every organization that has a reason to communicate with policymakers and has a function that does that needs to have a very clear reason for why, and has to be willing to put in the time and effort to remind these lawmakers day in and day out why they should care about a particular company or an organization's value proposition or portfolio of issues. I think in this partisan environment, it also means that it is a very crowded environment. The news cycle is crowded. There are big things happening that are pulling people's attention away from everything. We've also become a society that kind of, the newest tweet or the latest breaking news out of, some community far away from Washington steals all the spotlight. So there has to be a way to break through. And we think that's just day in and day out, reminding somebody why they should care about you and what it is you have to bring to their policy conversation.
Meghan, let me ask you to go touch deeper too. The other thing that you all do is, and I'm going to be Captain Obvious for a second, but a company, a corporation, they can't change their identity or their agenda every time the House flips, right? So it's really understanding what they're doing and, where to, step on the gas with some and maybe tap the brake with others, but keeping in perspective kind of where you're heading with all of this. Your reports really help folks kind of track that as well. Am I right?
Yes, they remind people that, just as you say, of course, emphasis will change as leadership shifts in our chambers of democracy. But any organization that has a reason to engage policymakers has to figure out a way to have an ongoing reputation and, never be singing out of, from different song sheets, if you will. There has to be a way to talk about inflation and supply chain, and then also, higher stakes on organizations for DEI or for engaging on social issues. Now, that can be really, really hard. We've seen some corporations that have struggled with their reputation among policymakers, usually with one party or the other, because perhaps their public emphasis on a social issue maybe has been bigger than some folks on the right think it should be, or it has been more muted than folks on the left think it should be. We see the only way to protect yourself from that is to figure out, like, you have to be authentic. And there is an authentic way to talk about your principles when it comes to social issues and your policy imperatives when it comes to the portfolio of issues that matter most to your business. We believe, and of course, at Penta, we think that the research is a guide for how you do that. And then when we advise clients like you do, Bryan, there's a way to say, okay, how do we have a top line message that is acceptable, palatable to everyone that you have to talk to? And then how do you take that and kind of go one click deeper and be able to go into your offices of one political persuasion and talk about the things that really can resonate with them. And by the way, something that I think we forget oftentimes in these conversations is that policymakers need input from the private sector too, and the entire landscape of stakeholders. They can't do their work in a vacuum. Oftentimes, a corporation is so much closer to people on the ground, their employees in a particular community, what those employees are facing, what the biggest challenges are to the local economy. Policymakers need that and want that. And so if you can have if you can figure out the issues that can, open up that conversation and kind of create a really, two-way open dialogue, it can be this very nice exchange of information. It's not just, hey, policymaker X, I need you to vote for my thing in this upcoming bill.
So on that point, let me bring you into this, Michael, because that's to me the crux of it, where you all are identifying kind of those priorities, how policymakers, think about those priorities and process what a lot of these corporations are doing. So let's jump into the report. What were the biggest takeaways from this year's report based on the interviews you all have been doing?
Well, look, I think it starts with, this is a dynamic environment. As you, Bryan, and Meghan were talking about, we are in a new legislative and political environment because of the razor-thin majorities, and that has implications both for the policy staff that were engaging on our work as well as the corporations that are engaging them. And there's new staff, right, with the new Congress, and that creates a challenge, but that also creates opportunities for us to take stock of how we're engaging and whether we're engaging productively and whether the strategies we had in place for the last Congress are still relevant. And so what we wanted to do in our research is really understand from the lens of the policymakers, how are they perceiving corporate engagement? What's seen as productive? What isn't seen as productive? And what would they like to see moving forward? There are a few kind of areas of focus this past year, driven by kind of the interests both of the companies that we work with as well as the policymakers. One was related to corporate engagement on social issues. So this is something we looked at 2 years ago, of course, but this year we really talked about in the context of ESG, which, as a framework and a term, has gotten a lot more attention and controversy as well in the last year. It was 2 years ago when we talked about ESG, there wasn't high levels of familiarity or awareness with that, unless you were sort of deep in that specialized area. In the last year, I think we saw a lot more awareness of that and a lot more polarization in terms of perceptions on both sides of the aisle. And so one of the things that we looked at this year is how are policymakers perceiving engagement related to ESG? And we talk a little bit more about that. We also asked them just in terms of the nuts and bolts of engagement, in terms of how policymakers are reaching out and engaging, whether that's in person, through electronic channels, a type of communications, what's working now, what isn't. And, I think there's some really interesting themes that we've seen there as well. I think the top line finding is keep it simple for them. Policy staff are incredibly busy. Depending on their portfolio, they may be a mile wide. And so there's an incredible premium on being able to very clearly, succinctly articulate your ask, why it's important to the policymaker in terms of their constituents. And just as importantly, how you package it. so they can then share that with their colleagues and peers.
So, Michael, we run into this a lot with our Penta clients, where ESG has become, as you said, both this like very politically charged term, but it's a very important function of business. So corporations are encouraged to be out there talking about their ESG agenda. At the same time, that lands on some politicians' doorsteps as a negative. But what's missing from this conversation is how complex and deep ESG really is. And you guys did a really great job, in my opinion, in this report, kind of breaking down all the aspects of ESG and I think really encouraging folks to kind of narrow in on the parts of it you want to talk about. So for our audience, can you break down a little bit of what you did in the report in terms of how you guys define ESG and how you encourage folks to kind of think of it that way when presenting it to a Hill or policymaker audience?
I think the first thing that's key to understand for the DC audience is that one of the reasons why ESG has been so successful in the investor community is because it is a big tent term or concept, and it's been able to draw in a variety of different elements within the investor community, ranging from faith-based investors to environmental sustainability investors to activist investors. So one of the keys to understanding ESG is that it represents many different approaches to investing, right? There are ESG investors who exclude certain companies or entire sectors because they don't meet certain criteria or thresholds. And then on the other hand, you have activists who actually seek out those companies who are not performing against those criteria so they can advocate for change. And then you've got everything in between, and where there's a wide swath of investors for whom ESG criteria is just another piece of information, another factor to incorporate into investment decisions, perhaps as a risk or performance factor when making asset allocation decisions.
Either of you, I would love to just talk more to how does that, we think about ESG, and what I think is often missing is how it relates to just corporate conduct and policy. And you get into the government issues, executive pay. I'm old enough to remember Arthur Anderson and other major issues that would be termed ESG. And I think in today's kind of whatever you want to call it, media environment, that's just lost.
So I think it's helpful to distinguish, policy that is very specific to ESG ratings or ESG investing versus policy related to the broader corporate engagement on the underlying issues. Right. So there are policy issues that are kind of more specialized related to things like disclosure requirements and fiduciary responsibilities. We talk about are the issues that corporations are more broadly engaging on related to the underlying issues. So environmental responsibility, social responsibility, which would include how they treat employees, things like diversity, equity, inclusion programs, their investment in communities. Things that in the corporate world we talk more about as corporate social responsibility. And so one of the things we try and do is sort of lay out how do some of these issues that companies are engaging on then relate to the policy issues that policymakers care about.
And can you break down a little bit? You've got a chart in here that I think would be important of how policymakers are perceiving corporate engagement. Like, what are they looking for?
Yeah, I think so while there is a lot of polarization around the term ESG and at the headline level, I think when we look at policymaker perceptions of engagement on the underlying issues, it's much, much more nuanced. And in fact, we find that policymakers on both sides of the aisle have very high standards for corporate conduct and corporate responsibility. And when we ask specifically about engagement on issues related to environmental responsibility or diversity, equity, and inclusion, we find that a majority of policymakers on both sides of the aisle believe that it's at least moderately important. Now, there are differences, right? It's much more important for the Democrats that we speak with, less so for the Republicans, but a broad majority believes that this is an important element of corporate responsibility. And I think where we see a lot of common ground is around engagement on issues that have a nexus with kind of core business purpose. And what we see when we talk to policymakers is that Democrats are very, very open and welcome engagement on social issues, and they expect it. Whereas we hear more concerns, especially among Republicans, when that engagement strays into political issues. or issues that are perceived to be outside of kind of core business issues. But we hear, I think, a fair amount of consensus that engagement on issues that are related to the business are productive, but it has to be authentic. And policymakers on both sides of the aisles, I think we hear a lot, are skeptical sometimes about how much of this is just talk versus action. And so when we ask them what does good look like here, things we hear from policymakers on both sides of the aisle, good looks like authentic, actionable, and accountable engagement on these issues.
Penta is the world's first comprehensive stakeholder solutions firm. We are a one-stop shop for the intelligence and strategy leaders need to assess a company's reputation and make decisions that improve their positioning. As executives in the C-suite must account for a growing set of engaged stakeholders, all with distinct, fast-changing demands, Penta provides real-time intelligence and strategy solutions. We work with clients solving complex global challenges across a variety of industries. Our clients span technology, financial services, energy, healthcare, and more. To learn more about how Penta can support your company, check out our website at pentagroup.co, our Twitter at PentaGRP, or find us on LinkedIn at Penta Group.
Meghan, let me bring you back in here and do one of my favorite things to do on podcasts, which is ask the really dumb question to get you to really tell us kind of what's going on. But why should businesses care about what policymakers think about all of this?
It's a really important question. Thank you for asking it. It's funny. When I used to work on the Hill and, you'd have a reporter that knew nothing about an issue and they asked you the question that's like the most obvious question. Those are actually the most dangerous to answer, as I'm sure you recall as well from your time doing the exact same thing. So a couple things. One, every business at some point has an issue before policymakers, be them on the federal level or in their states. And at that moment, policymakers can feel like this audience and you think, oh God, they are just like doing their thing, not in tune with, what businesses are doing or what employees need until the moment that they are. It's like, I think of over the years, more recently, we saw policymakers with the tech platforms, like what's a Finsta when there is a disconnect between what policymakers understand and what businesses need from them to navigate regulations, to navigate federal laws, to navigate same thing on the state level. That moment becomes this like, oh gosh, I wish that we had been engaging them for months before this so that I didn't have to, educate them on this issue that's really complex in the snap, in like the blink of an eye. We would tell clients, like, if you can help policymakers understand an issue long before it'll ever come to a vote or they're needing to move on something in committee, you will be so grateful. But then how do you do that? Like, how do you go in and break through and actually make them pay attention? Also, engaging policymakers is expensive. It takes staff. It takes people who can, create one-pagers, who are actually going into offices and, having that meeting where they sit down and do the first kind of like deep dive on a policy issue. So oftentimes you have to be able to go and explain to executives in the company or whoever is in charge of budget authority why you even need a policy team to go in and have these meetings. I guess that doesn't really answer your question on like, why should businesses care? I think that kind of takes you to, okay, once you've gotten them to care, what do they do about it? But I think if you could find me a business or an organization or any entity out there that has never had to worry about a policymaker not understanding or not caring about their issue, I'd say that's maybe a lucky one that, I don't know, you must be like the Apple Pie Association or something.
Right. And I would add that to your earlier point, you just can't afford to put something on the shelf for 2 years anymore.
Yeah.
They're such important issues. They're so critical to the core of your business for most of our clients that you have to have that data and that insight into a policymaker's mind to tell you, okay, this is how I'm going to go talk about this issue now with this Congress, given its political dynamics, maybe a little differently than I did last Congress or that I'll do next Congress. But again, staying authentic, just finding that, lane to really drive your point through. Michael, I wanted to ask you a question on the third section of this report, which is what I would deem very practical advice for engaging with Congress. And that may sound unusual to a lot of our listeners who probably engage with Congress every single day, but I think it really captures the point that, look, the world changed 2 years ago with COVID. We've seen radical kind of political transformation over the last couple of years too, both through Trump's presidency and post-Trump presidency. And this to me really was a guide to what policymakers directly from them, if I'm not mistaken, are looking for in terms of how they want to be engaged. Can you walk us through some of that advice and kind of thoughts you guys gleaned from these interviews?
Absolutely. I think in some ways, the more things change, the more they say the same. I think, as will be, no surprise to folks, who are actively engaging policymakers, relationships are still absolutely critical. And so that comes through in our conversations this year, and it comes through every year. So that's not news. What's interesting, though, I think, is what's changed and what's made engagement kind of more challenging. I think just as we look at the way in which policy staff consume information, the importance of digital channels, for example, that's changed dramatically in the last 10 years, even the last 5 years, and they're much more crowded. Levels of trust that we see across the board quite low. So this creates real kind of challenges for our folks who want to not just cut through, but have impact and be credible. So that's one of the things we're looking at this year. What are the channels that policymakers prefer to consume information? What do they find credible? One of the things that we ask every year and that we put together a summary of in this report is, what are the biggest pain points or pet peeves? And so I kind of referenced a few of those earlier in terms of kind of communications hygiene. So put it in a one-pager, have it be clear, address both sides of the argument. But there's also other ones that come out very clear as well in terms of being strategic about who and when you're engaging. So one of the things we heard from policymakers is overly narrow engagement, either with just the member or a few offices, right, can be unproductive in the sense that you want to lay the groundwork with the staff who are ultimately going to be weighing in on key decisions when an ask is made. And also just being strategic about timing as well. So being aware of the legislative cycle and what that means for the policy staff is another request that we heard from policymakers. But again, I think it all comes back to, if I had to sum up in one thing, keep it simple for the policymakers, make good use of their time.
It's good advice. This report and a lot of your work provides insights into the importance of engagement, how to engage. There are certainly folks out there that think they understand the Hill well, that think they know their reputation on the Hill, inside and out. How does your work and data still kind of inform sort of their point of view and their strategy in Washington?
We are the only firm in the world who gathers insights directly from the people you are engaging when you're an organization that engages policymakers. Let me also say, we would never challenge somebody who has been the head of GR at a corporation for 20 years and has those 5 or 10 or maybe even 15 priority offices, or they know them like the back of their hand. Yes, that's true. But those aren't the only people that matter in Congress. And to the point before on, you never know when an issue becomes important or when something, like think of like derivatives, and then like all of a sudden you had financial services lobbyists engaging agriculture, the Ag Committee in the Senate years ago with God, Bryan, you probably remember better than I do what was happening. I just remember Blanche Lincoln holding derivatives hearings in the Senate Ag Committee. It's important to have a finger on the pulse of the bodies broadly and understand where issues are starting to perk up. So when we go out and do our quantitative research, it just means we have these open-ended conversations. Of course, we can probe for anything. We go in with an agenda. We know what we need to find out. We know the issues that we're going to ask. But sometimes it's in those conversations where we start hearing the first little bits of something that like in the next Congress is the number one issue that everybody is paying attention to. So it's not only kind of seeing around the corner, but it's also just, it's like a broader view of policymakers and what they're thinking about, what they're listening to, what matters most to them. And it's kind of like the playbook for how you can engage with success.
One thing I would just add on to what Meghan's said here is that one of the things that makes this hard is that we're not just, if we're corporate executives, engaging policymakers, we're also engaging all the other stakeholders. And so one of the things that's hard is how do we make sure that we're communicating the perspective of how our engagement is landing in DC with internal stakeholders so that equity can be balanced with all the other equities that we're trying to balance in the C-suite. And that's also a real challenge as well. How do we bring data and stories to the table that help inform those conversations that are happening as these tricky issues emerge and decisions are being made on how to engage them in the C-suite?
Let me end with one final question, not to put you all on the spot, but I'm sure you're in a similar position as I am often. A lot of my clients, they have a decent understanding about DC, but they tell me, look, I'm losing sleep over what's going to happen in California on this policy, or what policymakers in Brussels or somewhere else are thinking, and how that's going to end up pressuring Washington. How do you all, what capabilities do you all have to kind of help inform that part of policy strategy for our clients?
Well, the good news is we are in both of those places, and really any state, any government around the world. Our specialty is figuring out who are the people that matter, whose opinions matter most to our clients, and then how do we go extract the insights that they need. And we've successfully do that across the country, in state houses around the country. We're doing it in Brussels. We're doing it in Asia. And it's really exciting. It's really like as the need comes, that's where we go define a new market. But the interesting thing is that while the issues change and the nuance on issues, the bent, like California, you mentioned California. That's a really interesting one because I think like some people like joke the Great Republic of California. I mean, obviously that it could be a country all unto itself. So like the bent of how issues are discussed change, but policymakers are kind of the same. I mean, they're all trying to satisfy their constituents, do what's right, and make use of the scarce, our biggest or our most scarce resource, which is time, right? So it's been really interesting as policy issues creep across oceans and kind of broaden and touch all different places. It's been fun to kind of tap into new markets.
That's incredibly helpful. I'm sure you guys are in the same spot. It's not one jurisdiction anymore. It's companies are taking it from all sides, all stakeholders, all different governments. So, well, with that, let me wrap it there. And I want to thank Meghan and Michael so much for joining us on today's episode of What's at Stake. For our listeners who maybe haven't seen the report yet, we'll be sure to include it in the show notes, along with some more information on this unique Penta Policy Insiders network that we've built, informing reports like the Washington Insights Review. And for more episodes of What's at Stake, you can subscribe to the Penta podcast channel wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us on Twitter at PentaGRP or on our website, pentagroup.co. I'm Bryan DeAngelis. As always, thanks again for listening to What's at Stake.